Have you ever been in a situation where you were tempted to respond unkindly to someone? I mean, you were doing all you could to hold on and not be harsh to that person, but they have just challenged you and it was the last straw and you responded in an unkind way. Well, you knew it was the wrong way to respond. And honestly, I've been in a very similar position myself. In fact, it is a regular occurrence with me where this person, whoever it may be, has just really gotten my goat and I responded in an unkind way. Well, in this video, I want to share with you, hopefully it will encourage you to not to respond unkindly to those people who challenge you. So I was just doing my devotions and I was reading the story about the death of Saul, the king of Israel, and how that went down. And I want to share a few thoughts from that story in the end of 1 Samuel and the beginning of 2 Samuel. And I hope that it will encourage you, maybe convict you. But my goal here is that it will help you as it helped me not to respond unkindly to people who really just get your goat. All right, so here's the setup. At the end of 1 Samuel, we read about the death of Saul. He was on Mount Gilboa. He was fighting the Philistines, and he and his son Jonathan were wounded. And so Saul asked his armor bearer if he would kill him because he did not want the Philistines to do it. And of course, the armor bearer responded at the end of 1 Samuel saying, I cannot do this. He didn't want to kill the Lord's anointed. And so what Saul did instead is he just fell upon his sword. Saul just committed suicide. And that's how it went down. That's how Saul died. And so then you turn the page to 2 Samuel, the first chapter. And there's this guy who comes to David. He's an Amalekite. And he tells David that Saul has died. And then David asks him, well, how do you know this? And the Amalekite tells David that I came upon this scene on Mount Gilboa, and Saul was wounded, and Saul wanted me to kill him, and I knew that this was the right thing to do rather than letting the Philistines kill Saul, and so I killed Saul. Well, he lied. That's not what happened. But when David heard this story, wait, you killed the Lord's anointed? Well, then he asked his men to go and execute this Amalekite, assuming that this Amalekite did as he said, that he killed Saul. And so he was executed. Now, this is a phenomenal story. And the reason it's phenomenal is because David would not reach out and kill the Lord's anointed, Saul, even though Saul was a terrible person. You see, there were a couple of situations in 1 Samuel where David, he was sneaking up on Saul, and at one point he took his sword and took some of his equipment, and then he got away from Saul, and then he yelled back and he said, hey, I cut off a piece of your garment, I got your equipment. I mean, on 2 occasions. And what he was telling Saul is, even though you're so blooming mean to me, even though you have been so unkind, I could have killed you 2 times, but I did not kill you because you are the Lord's anointed. And so David's take on Saul, even though you're like super unkind, even though you have tried to kill me, I am not going to respond that way to you. And even when in 2 Samuel chapter 1, when David heard that this Amalekite had killed Saul, even though it wasn't true, he had him executed, because he said, you do not touch the Lord's anointing. Now, I find this absolutely a phenomenal sequence of events. David had the opportunity to put Saul to death, but he would not. And when David found out that someone had put Saul to death, he had that person executed because this was the Lord's anointed. David was so sensitive about God's call on Saul's life that he would not do anything unkind to him, even though Saul was very unkind to David. Now, here's my takeaway, and this is how I have applied it to my own life, is that everybody is made in the image of God. Everybody is an image bearer, whether they are saved or lost. And because of that, we want to be very careful how we communicate to image bearers. In fact, James talked about this in James 3. He says, out of one side of our mouth we bless the Lord, and out of the other side of our mouth we curse those who are made in the similitude, is what the King James Bible says. And what that means is that we curse those who are made in the image of God. And James says, my children, this ought not to be. That we want to be very careful how we communicate to image bearers, whether they know the Lord or not. And you see a similar concept at the end of 1 Samuel, the death of Saul, and at the beginning of 1 Samuel, in 2 Samuel, when David finds out about the death of Saul. He was very sensitive about not doing any harm to the Lord's anointed. And then in a parallel, in a similar way, James is telling us that we need to be very careful about how we communicate to those who are made in the image of God, which is everybody. And so we want to be kind in how we communicate to those who are made in the image of God, whether they know the Lord or not. Now, I am not saying that we don't speak the truth in love. I am not saying that we don't stand up and be courageous and we take a stand for the Lord. But how we communicate these things to others, we want to make sure that our communication is salted with wisdom, because the anger of man does not bring about the righteousness of God. And so we can communicate hard things to people, but we can do it with the right attitude and in the right spirit. And so as I was reading the end of 1 Samuel and the beginning of 2 Samuel, this death of Saul on Mount Gilboa, and how David responded, and even though David had many opportunities to put Saul to death, he would not do it. And so we want to be careful with how we communicate to fellow image bearers. I trust that serves you. I hope it encourages you. Maybe it convicts you in the attitude in which you communicate to other people. It most definitely convicted me, because again, sometimes I'm tempted to respond in unkind ways. Now again, you want to make that distinction. I'm not saying to withhold the truth, but how we communicate the truth makes all the difference in the world.